I never thought I'd see the day when I'd be the one to teach a lesson to a cop. But that day came, and it started with a simple act of kindness. Elizabeth Johnson never expected her day to end this way. At 68, her life had slowed down significantly. Retired from her long career as a federal judge, she spent her days quietly in her modest neighborhood, taking care of the stray cats that had become her companions. A basket of food and a bottle of water was all it took to make her feel useful. But today, her usual peaceful routine would be shattered in a way she could never have imagined. It all started when she sat down on the weathered bench by the alley, unpacking the cans of tuna she'd brought for the hungry cats. The rain had softened, and the air was thick with humidity. She barely noticed the officer approaching at first, not until she heard his voice cut through the quiet. "What do you think you're doing here?" Elizabeth looked up, her heart sinking slightly. Officer James Anderson, young, built like a linebacker, stood towering over her. His expression was one of pure disdain, like she had done something wrong just by existing in his path. "I'm just feeding the cats, officer," she replied calmly, her voice steady despite the sudden rush of anxiety in her chest. She knew this neighborhood all too well. She'd spent years here, and she'd always felt safe, even in her retirement. But today was different. "I don't care what you're doing," he snapped, his tone sharp and dismissive. "You need to move along. This is private property." Elizabeth stood slowly, her joints aching with each movement, but she wasn't intimidated. "I'm not causing any harm, officer. Just feeding these poor animals," she said, her voice firm but still respectful. The officer's eyes narrowed, and he stepped closer, towering over her like a storm cloud ready to burst. "I said move," he repeated, the words coming out like a threat. Elizabeth's hand trembled slightly as she gathered the last can of tuna, but she didn't back down. She had seen too much in her years as a judge, too much injustice, too much unfairness. But in that moment, it wasn't her past as a federal judge that gave her strength, it was her sense of right and wrong. Officer Anderson reached out, grabbing her by the arm and pulling her roughly toward the gate. Elizabeth gasped, her breath catching in her throat as he manhandled her. The cats scattered, startled by the sudden commotion. She turned to face him, and with a quiet, unwavering voice, she said, "You don't know who I am, do you?" He scoffed, his grip still tight on her arm. "What does that matter? You're just some old lady feeding cats." Elizabeth didn't flinch. She pulled herself upright, meeting his gaze with a calm but piercing stare. "I used to be a federal judge," she said, the words hanging in the air like a quiet storm. Officer Anderson froze for a moment, his eyes widening in disbelief. He had never expected her to say that. In his mind, she was just an elderly woman, a nobody. But now, his entire demeanor shifted. He slowly released his grip, stepping back, unsure of what to do next. He started, his voice faltering for the first time. Elizabeth straightened, taking a deep breath. "I fought for justice for decades. I didn't sit in courtrooms for all those years just to watch a man like you treat people this way," she continued, her voice gaining strength with each word. The officer stood still, looking at her as if seeing her for the first time. The tough exterior he'd carried with him melted away, replaced by a flicker of doubt. But before he could say anything else, Elizabeth took a final look at the now scattered cats, bent down to pick up her bag, and walked past him, her steps slow but purposeful. The officer didn't stop her. He didn't even apologize. He just watched as she walked away, her dignity intact. As Elizabeth turned the corner, the weight of the moment settled over her. She had stood up, not just for herself, but for anyone who had ever been unfairly treated. It wasn't just the act of feeding stray cats that had been interrupted. It was the belief that kindness, no matter how small, could still make a difference in a world that often forgot the value of respect. She didn't look back, but she knew one thing for sure. Today, she had taught Officer Anderson a lesson he would never forget. And maybe, just maybe, it would change him. A small act of kindness, a simple refusal to back down, had turned the tables on someone who thought he could bully the weak. Elizabeth Johnson walked away with her head held high, knowing that even the smallest among us could hold the most power, if only we stood up for what's right. Ignoring the cold rain that had started to fall harder, Elizabeth kept walking, the weight of the moment still hanging in the air. She had never imagined that a simple trip to feed the cats would lead to such an encounter. Her thoughts were calm, But there was something deeper, something inside her that felt different now, something that stirred beneath the surface. She walked slowly, her steps measured, but her heart was lighter. She had stood up for herself, and for the first time in a long while, she felt the power of her own presence. Elizabeth turned the corner and made her way back to her small apartment. The building was old, but it had character. It was where she had spent most of her retirement. The neighborhood was quiet, full of memories, of old friends, and of the people she had spent her years serving as a judge. But it wasn't the building or the street that had made her feel at home. It was the small acts of kindness she gave every day, feeding the stray cats, helping the elderly neighbor across the street with her groceries, or simply greeting the mailman with a smile. Elizabeth had never needed much, just the satisfaction of knowing she could make a difference in someone's life, no matter how small. As she reached her door, she paused, digging into her bag for the keys. Her fingers brushed against something unfamiliar, a small folded piece of paper. She pulled it out, wondering where it had come from. Opening it, she read the note. "I'm sorry for the way I treated you. You didn't deserve that. I'll do better. Officer Anderson." Her hand trembled slightly as she held the note in her palm. Elizabeth had never expected an apology, not from someone like him. She had already assumed he would never acknowledge what had happened. But here it was, a small piece of paper with words that carried weight. Words that were sincere, though simple. Elizabeth let out a slow breath. She was still in disbelief, but something inside her felt warmed by the gesture. Maybe people could change. Maybe even the hardest hearts could be softened by the truth. She folded the note carefully and slipped it into her coat pocket before unlocking her door. As she stepped inside, she felt a quiet peace settle over her. The cats were waiting for her, as always, their soft meows greeting her as she entered. Elizabeth smiled, setting down her bag and opening a can of tuna for them. It was a small act, but it was one she had done 1,000 times before. As she fed the cats, her mind wandered back to the encounter with Officer Anderson. She couldn't help but think that maybe, just maybe, there was something more to this story. She had taught him a lesson today, but perhaps, in a way, he had taught her something too. People, no matter their status or their past actions, were capable of change. It wasn't about power or authority. It was about recognizing when you were wrong and doing what was necessary to make things right. Elizabeth didn't expect Officer Anderson to show up at her door again, but she knew that his apology meant something. It meant that, even in the face of adversity, kindness and courage could break through. That was the real power. It was a lesson she had learned long ago, but it had never felt more meaningful than it did now. And as the rain began to ease, Elizabeth sat back in her chair, the warmth of the cats curled up at her feet, and allowed herself to feel something she hadn't in years: hope. Maybe, just maybe, the world was still capable of change. "I have learned so much today," Officer Anderson thought to himself, sitting in his patrol car as he stared out at the now clear sky. The rain had stopped, but the weight of the events of the day still hung heavily on him. He had never expected to feel conflicted about a situation like this. Yet here he was, struggling to reconcile his past actions with the truth that had been laid bare in front of him. It was a slow realization, but it was there, undeniable. Elizabeth Johnson had shown him something he had never expected, a sense of strength, of dignity, and of kindness that made him question the very principles he had lived by. He had been so quick to judge her, to assume she was just an old lady who didn't deserve respect, but in her eyes, he saw something more. He saw a person who had lived through struggles, who had earned her place, and who was more than capable of standing up for herself when the time came. His thoughts were interrupted as he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the small, crumpled note that Elizabeth had left him. "I'm sorry for the way I treated you. You didn't deserve that. I'll do better," he read again, his eyes lingering on the words. They weren't just an apology, they were a challenge to do better, to be better. He had failed her today, and that failure weighed heavily on his conscience. He had always prided himself on doing the right thing, on serving justice. But today he had been a part of something unjust, and now, he couldn't stop thinking about how he could make it right. It was easy to keep living life as he had been, to ignore the mistakes and move on. But something in Elizabeth's quiet strength had sparked a change within him. He knew he couldn't let this moment pass without action. He had to face the consequences of his actions, no matter how uncomfortable it felt. The following day, Officer Anderson found himself at the local community center. He had arrived early, long before his shift started, to meet with a group of officers who had been trained in cultural sensitivity. He had always considered himself open-minded, but the events with Elizabeth had shown him that being open-minded wasn't enough. He needed to truly understand the impact of his actions, the way his words and behavior affected others. As the session began, Officer Anderson found himself listening more than speaking. He absorbed every word, every lesson about empathy, respect, and understanding. The more he listened, the more he realized just how much he had taken for granted. He had never considered how his actions might be perceived by others, how his position of authority could intimidate or belittle those who were already vulnerable. By the time the session ended, Officer Anderson felt like a different person. He knew he still had a long way to go, but he was determined to make a change. He could no longer turn a blind eye to the inequalities around him. As he walked out of the community center, he felt a sense of responsibility that he had never felt before. He was no longer just a cop. He was a part of something bigger. He had a duty to serve and protect everyone, not just those who looked like him or who held power. He couldn't undo what had happened with Elizabeth, but he could make sure it didn't happen again. Meanwhile, Elizabeth had settled into her evening routine, the weight of the past few days still lingering, but not heavy enough to overshadow the quiet contentment she felt. She had received a phone call earlier from a local reporter who had heard about the incident and wanted to interview her. Elizabeth had politely declined, explaining that she wasn't interested in fame or recognition. She simply wanted to live her life in peace, to continue doing what she could for the world, even if it was just feeding the stray cats and offering a kind word to a neighbor. That evening, as Elizabeth sat on her porch watching the cats eat, she heard a familiar sound, the hum of a car engine pulling up outside her building. She glanced up, expecting to see nothing more than another delivery truck or neighbor passing by. But when she looked closer, she recognized the car. It was Officer Anderson's patrol car. Her heart skipped a beat as she wondered what he could want. Had he come to apologize again, or was there something else? The door opened, and Officer Anderson stepped out, his face unreadable but his posture resolute. Elizabeth stood, her feet moving instinctively, a mix of curiosity and caution in her movements. "Hello, Elizabeth," he said quietly as he approached her, his voice steady. "I wanted to come by and apologize again. I've been thinking a lot about what happened, and I realized I didn't just fail you. I failed myself. I didn't act with the respect and integrity I should have." Elizabeth nodded slowly, her gaze calm but assessing. "I appreciate your words, officer," she replied. "But I don't need an apology from you. What I need is for you to be the man you've shown me you can be. I need you to show others the respect that you're offering me now." Officer Anderson nodded, understanding her words. He had come to see that real change didn't come from empty promises. It came from action. He had a lot of work to do, but he was ready to begin. He turned to leave, but not before saying one last thing. "Thank you, Elizabeth. You've taught me more than I can put into words." And with that, he walked back to his car, a man determined to make things right. The days that followed were quieter for Elizabeth, but they weren't without their weight. She continued with her usual routine, feeding the cats, speaking with her neighbors, and quietly reflecting on the encounter with Officer Anderson. The apology was still fresh in her mind, but it wasn't the apology itself that kept her thinking. It was the realization that sometimes real change took time. Change didn't happen overnight, and it didn't come just because someone said the right words. It came when people truly examined their actions, learned from them, and made an effort to do better. Elizabeth knew this well. She had spent her career as a federal judge, upholding the law, but it was in the quiet moments like these that she found the most clarity. One afternoon, as she was walking to the local market to pick up some bread and milk, she saw something that made her pause. It was Officer Anderson, standing outside the community center, speaking with a group of young men who were clearly from the neighborhood. Elizabeth had seen him around before, but this time, there was something different about him. He wasn't just talking to them. He was listening in a way that she had never seen before. He didn't speak from a place of authority or judgment, but from a place of understanding. Elizabeth continued walking, but she couldn't help but notice the subtle shift. It wasn't just his behavior that had changed, it was the way he carried himself. There was a quiet humility about him now, a recognition of the responsibility he had to those around him. It wasn't long before she saw him again, this time on her own street. He was parked by the curb, not in his patrol car, but in his personal vehicle. As Elizabeth passed by, she gave him a nod, unsure if he would recognize her. But he did. His eyes met hers, and for a brief moment, he gave her a small, genuine smile. "Hello, Elizabeth," he said. "I've been thinking about what you said. I want you to know I'm making changes. Not just in how I do my job, but in how I see people." Elizabeth paused for a moment, studying his face. There was something in his eyes that hadn't been there before, a glimmer of understanding, of someone who was learning, evolving. "That's good to hear, Officer Anderson," she replied softly. "It's not about saying the right things, it's about doing them. It's about showing respect to people, no matter who they are." He nodded, his expression serious. "I know, and I'm committed to doing better." As he spoke, Elizabeth couldn't help but feel a sense of cautious optimism. This wasn't the officer she had first encountered, the one who had treated her like she was invisible. This was someone who was slowly becoming aware of the power of empathy, the importance of listening, and the need for true justice. Over the next few weeks, Elizabeth noticed more subtle changes. Officer Anderson seemed more present in the community, speaking with the residents, listening to their concerns, and offering help where it was needed. It was clear that he was working hard to rebuild the trust he had lost, not just with Elizabeth, but with everyone who had seen him act out of line. It wasn't always easy. There were moments when his old instincts kicked in, moments when he was tempted to revert to his former ways. But each time, he fought it, remembering the lesson Elizabeth had taught him. One evening, as Elizabeth sat on her porch watching the sun set, she saw Officer Anderson walking down the street, this time alone. He stopped when he saw her, giving her a polite wave. Elizabeth returned the wave with a small smile. He walked up to her porch, pausing at the bottom step. "I just wanted to thank you again, Elizabeth," he said quietly, "for not giving up on me, for showing me what it means to be truly just, not just in my job, but in my life." Elizabeth looked at him for a moment, then nodded. "Everyone deserves a chance to change, officer, but it's up to you to make it happen." There was a long pause before he spoke again. "I've learned that, and I promise you, I will keep learning." As he turned to leave, Elizabeth watched him walk away, feeling a quiet sense of peace settle over her. She knew there was still much work to be done, but she also knew that change was possible. And sometimes, the smallest actions, like standing up for yourself or showing kindness to others, could spark something much bigger. It had taken one moment, one small act of defiance, for her to change the course of her life and someone else's. And now, as she sat on her porch, surrounded by the quiet hum of the evening, Elizabeth felt that same spark of hope. There was still goodness in the world. It was still possible to make a difference. As the months passed, Elizabeth began to notice more and more of the community changing around her. The streets, which had once felt quiet and disconnected, now had a different energy to them. It wasn't just the crispness of the air or the subtle shift of the seasons that made her feel this way. It was the quiet transformation taking place right before her eyes. Officer Anderson had become a regular figure in the neighborhood, not as a figure of authority, but as someone who genuinely cared. She'd seen him sitting on a bench by the park, talking with local shop owners, and sometimes, even lending a hand to elderly residents with their groceries. The officer she had first encountered, rude, dismissive, and distant, was gradually being replaced by someone more empathetic, more approachable. Elizabeth didn't know if it was just the community itself shifting, or if it was something within Officer Anderson that had changed, but the change was undeniable. One morning, as she was sipping her coffee on the porch, she saw him once again, walking down the street, this time with a group of teenagers from the neighborhood. They weren't just chatting casually. They were laughing, the way young people do when they feel heard and understood. Officer Anderson wasn't talking down to them or giving them orders. Instead, he was laughing with them, sharing a light-hearted story. Elizabeth watched from a distance, impressed by the bond that seemed to have developed between him and the youth. She could see the difference in the way the young men interacted with him. There was respect now, a mutual understanding. It wasn't just his uniform that commanded respect anymore. It was his willingness to listen and connect. She knew that he had come a long way since that day on the street when he had first apologized. Elizabeth had never expected to see this side of him, but now it was clear he wasn't just changing his behavior, he was changing his approach to life. He was understanding what it truly meant to serve and protect, not just with the law, but with empathy. That afternoon, she ran into him again, this time on her way to the market. Officer Anderson was standing by his car, holding a bag of groceries, speaking with a local woman who looked slightly uncomfortable at first. Elizabeth watched closely, curious. She knew that this was a neighborhood where people sometimes kept their distance, but as the conversation continued, she noticed the woman's posture soften. She wasn't just nodding politely anymore. She was actually talking to him, engaging in the conversation. When Officer Anderson turned to leave, Elizabeth caught his eye. "Good to see you, Elizabeth," he said, offering her a warm smile. She returned the smile, her eyes softening as she nodded in acknowledgement. "You seem different," she said simply, her voice steady but kind. "I am different," he replied, his voice sincere. "I've learned a lot over these past few months. And I'm still learning." Elizabeth paused, taking in his words. There was no arrogance in his tone, no defensiveness. He simply acknowledged the change that had taken place within him. It was a far cry from the officer who had once spoken to her with such condescension. "I'm glad to hear that," she said. "Change is never easy, but it's always worth it." Officer Anderson nodded. "I agree." And with that, they both parted ways, Elizabeth heading to the market and Officer Anderson continuing on his patrol. As she walked, Elizabeth reflected on the quiet transformation that had taken place. The community was changing, yes, but it wasn't just the streets that were different. The people were changing too, learning to listen to one another, learning to respect one another. She couldn't help but think of the ripple effect of small acts of kindness and understanding. It all started with a simple encounter, a small act of defiance, and a willingness to see things differently. Officer Anderson had learned that lesson, and in doing so, he had sparked something bigger than just a personal transformation. He had inspired those around him to question their own actions, their own biases, and their own understanding of what it meant to truly serve others. It wasn't just about following the law. It was about following the heart, the understanding that every person, no matter who they were or where they came from, deserved respect. Elizabeth's life had changed that day, just as Officer Anderson's had. But more importantly, the community had changed. And as Elizabeth walked home, she felt a sense of hope rise in her chest. It was a quiet hope, but it was there, steady and sure. She didn't know what the future would bring, but she knew that sometimes, all it took was one person, one action, to change the course of many lives. Elizabeth walked through the familiar streets of her neighborhood, her pace slow and steady, a quiet peace settling over her as she took in the surroundings. It had been a year since that day when Officer Anderson had first apologized to her, and since then, there had been subtle yet profound changes. The community felt more connected, more alive. People who once kept to themselves were now greeting each other with smiles, and the simple acts of kindness she had practiced for years seemed to have taken root in others as well. Elizabeth's heart swelled with a quiet pride, not just for the changes she had witnessed, but for the small part she had played in them. It wasn't about grand gestures or public recognition, it was the ripple effect that mattered. A simple moment of standing up for herself had sparked something larger. She had learned long ago that true change didn't come from force or anger. It came from understanding, from seeing others for who they truly were, beyond the surface. And now, as she walked past the local grocery store, she noticed something that made her pause. Officer Anderson was standing outside, speaking with a young man who looked familiar. Elizabeth had seen him around before, often hanging out with his friends near the park. He was one of the many teenagers who had been skeptical of authority, but there was something different in his body language now. He wasn't avoiding the officer's gaze or speaking in short, dismissive sentences. Instead, he was listening. And Officer Anderson, who had once been the embodiment of authority, was now speaking to him with genuine interest, offering advice, not orders. Elizabeth smiled softly to herself. It was moments like these that reminded her of the power of patience, the power of being present for others, especially when they were at their most vulnerable. She had been patient with Officer Anderson, and now she was seeing the fruits of that patience in the form of the young man who was learning that not all authority figures were to be feared. Elizabeth continued her walk, reflecting on how far things had come. She passed by the park, where she noticed a group of children playing together, some black, some white, some Asian, all laughing as they chased each other around. It was a sight that filled her with a deep sense of gratitude. This neighborhood, This community had come together in ways she hadn't expected, and it was a beautiful thing to witness. Elizabeth had lived through many challenges in her life, but she had never stopped believing in the potential for growth and change. In the years she had spent as a judge, she had seen the worst of humanity, but she had also seen the best. And she had always believed that people could change, that they could learn to see beyond their prejudices, beyond their differences. It was something she held on to tightly, even when it seemed like the world was full of division. Now, as she walked back to her apartment, she could see that her faith had not been misplaced. People were learning. People were growing. And while the world wasn't perfect, it was better than it had been before. That evening, as the sun began to set and the sky turned a soft shade of orange, Elizabeth sat on her porch with a cup of tea, the soft hum of the neighborhood filling the air. It was a quiet moment, but it was enough. She had worked hard to create a life for herself after her retirement, and she had found joy in the small things. The birds singing in the morning, the sight of the cats lounging in the sun, the sound of children's laughter in the distance. It was these simple things that made life beautiful, and it was these simple things that she held dear. As she sipped her tea, Elizabeth thought about Officer Anderson. She hadn't seen him as much recently, but she had heard from some of the neighbors that he had been doing well. They spoke of how he had been spending more time with the community, helping out where he could, and offering guidance to the younger generation. It was clear that he was still learning, still growing. Elizabeth smiled to herself. She had always believed that change was possible, even in the most unlikely places. And Officer Anderson was living proof of that. As she sat there, she felt a deep sense of fulfillment. She had done what she could, and she had seen the impact of her actions ripple outward. She had helped one person see the world differently, and in doing so, she had helped the whole community change. It wasn't about being recognized. It wasn't about getting credit. It was about making a difference, no matter how small, no matter how quiet. And as Elizabeth finished her tea and stood up to go inside, she knew that the world was full of possibility. As long as there were people willing to change, there was hope for a better future. It was a crisp Saturday morning when Elizabeth walked down the familiar street, a soft breeze brushing through the trees. It had been a few months since Officer Anderson had made his decision to truly change, and the transformation was clear in the way he moved through the neighborhood now. His presence, once a symbol of authority and distance, had shifted into something more human. He was often seen engaging with people in the community, offering a helping hand when needed and listening with genuine interest to the concerns of those around him. Elizabeth had seen him working with local youth, leading discussions about respect, understanding, and the importance of community. Today, as she passed by the park, she noticed him once again, this time sitting on the grass with a group of teenagers. They were gathered in a circle, listening intently as Officer Anderson spoke about the importance of seeing each other beyond stereotypes. Elizabeth paused for a moment, watching from a distance. It was clear that his efforts were paying off. The young people were no longer just avoiding him or viewing him as an authority figure. They were engaging, asking questions, and sharing their thoughts. Officer Anderson wasn't just telling them what was right. He was helping them understand why it mattered. The bond he had formed with the youth in the neighborhood was unlike anything Elizabeth had seen before. It wasn't just about being a figure of authority. It was about being someone they could trust, someone they could look to for guidance without fear of judgment. Elizabeth couldn't help but smile as she continued on her way. The changes she had seen in Officer Anderson were more than just behavioral. They were a reflection of a deeper understanding, a shift in his perspective that had ripple effects far beyond their initial encounter. The neighborhood itself had transformed in subtle but profound ways. People were more connected now, more willing to lend a hand to those in need. The quiet acts of kindness, once small and isolated, had become a shared effort. It was as if everyone had started to understand the importance of lifting each other up, of showing respect and empathy in even the smallest of gestures. Elizabeth had always believed in the power of community, and now she could see it in action. As she walked past the community center, she noticed a few familiar faces from the neighborhood. They waved at her, and she smiled back, greeting them by name. It wasn't long before Officer Anderson approached, walking alongside a young boy who had been part of the group earlier. "Good morning, Elizabeth," he said with a warm smile. "I wanted to introduce you to Jamal here." He's been working with us on a new initiative to mentor younger kids in the neighborhood. Elizabeth turned to the boy, offering him a friendly smile. Nice to meet you, Jamal, she said, extending her hand. It's good to see young people getting involved. Jamal grinned, shaking her hand with enthusiasm. I've learned a lot from Officer Anderson, he said proudly. I want to help others the way he helped me. Elizabeth's heart warmed as she listened to Jamal's words. This was what change looked like. It wasn't just about one person, one interaction. It was about the way the lessons passed from one individual to the next, creating a ripple effect that spread throughout the community. She had witnessed it firsthand with Officer Anderson, and now she was seeing it with Jamal. Officer Anderson stood back, watching as Elizabeth and Jamal spoke. His expression was one of quiet pride, a reflection of the growth he had experienced over the past year. It was clear to Elizabeth that the officer she had met was no longer the same person. He had shed the layers of judgment and distance that had once defined him, replacing them with empathy, humility, and a desire to make a real difference. Elizabeth looked at the young boy and smiled. Keep up the good work, Jamal, she said. You're setting a great example for others. Jamal beamed, his eyes shining with the excitement of being part of something meaningful. Thanks, Elizabeth. I'll do my best. As the conversation continued, Elizabeth felt a sense of fulfillment wash over her. It wasn't about any one individual's actions, but the collective effort that made the biggest impact. The neighborhood had grown stronger because people were willing to change, to open their hearts and minds to one another. And while there was still work to be done, Elizabeth knew that the foundation for something truly transformative had been laid. She walked away from the conversation with a sense of peace. She had seen the power of kindness, the power of listening, and the power of giving others the chance to grow. And in doing so, she had helped create a ripple effect that would continue to spread for years to come. Elizabeth didn't need grand gestures to know that she had made a difference. She had seen it in the faces of the people around her, in the conversations that were taking place, in the way the neighborhood had come together. It was a quiet, steady change, but it was real. And that, she knew, was enough. Elizabeth had always believed that small acts of kindness could change the world, but never had she witnessed it as clearly as she had in the past few months. The community, once filled with tension and distance, now felt like a family. People who were truly starting to understand each other, who were coming together not because they had to, but because they wanted to. The signs of change were everywhere. More people were saying hello to each other, stopping to chat in the streets, and working together on neighborhood projects. The park, once a place where only a few people gathered, was now a hub of activity, with kids of all backgrounds playing together, sharing stories, and building friendships. Officer Anderson had become a constant presence in this transformation, not as a figure of authority, but as a mentor and a friend. He had found his place, not just in his uniform, but in the hearts of the people he had once distanced himself from. Elizabeth had seen him grow in ways she never thought possible. He had taken to mentoring the youth in the neighborhood, especially those who had been the hardest to reach. Every weekend, he would be there in the park, talking to the kids, helping them with their schoolwork, or simply listening to their stories. It wasn't just about teaching them how to respect authority. It was about teaching them how to respect each other, how to value themselves, and how to make a positive impact on the world around them. Elizabeth had noticed the difference in the kids too. They no longer saw Officer Anderson as someone to fear. They saw him as someone who genuinely cared about them. It was a subtle change, but it was a powerful one. It wasn't about the uniform he wore or the badge on his chest. It was about the heart behind it. He had learned to be there for the community in a way that was both meaningful and lasting. And in doing so, he had earned their respect, not through force or authority, but through understanding and connection. One afternoon, Elizabeth was sitting on her porch, watching the world go by as she sipped her tea. It had become her favorite part of the day, this quiet time where she could reflect and take in the simple beauty of her surroundings. The sun was beginning to set, casting a warm glow over the neighborhood, and she felt a sense of peace wash over her. As she looked down the street, she saw Officer Anderson walking toward her, this time without his uniform, dressed casually in jeans and a jacket. He waved as he approached, and Elizabeth smiled, standing up to greet him. "Good afternoon, Elizabeth," he said with a smile. "I wanted to check in with you." Elizabeth chuckled softly. "You know, I'm not the one who needs checking in on," she replied. I think you've done more than enough already. Officer Anderson's smile faltered for just a second, but then he nodded. I've been thinking about a lot of things lately, he began, his voice quieter now. And I wanted to thank you, Elizabeth, for showing me the way. Elizabeth looked at him, her expression softening. You did the work, officer. I just gave you a little push in the right direction. He shook his head. No, it wasn't just that. You made me see things differently. You helped me understand that change isn't just about doing the right thing in the moment. It's about the small things, the everyday actions that build trust, that build relationships. I'm learning that now, but it's a process. And I wouldn't be here without your example. Elizabeth felt a warmth spread through her chest as she listened to his words. She had always known that change was possible, but seeing it in action, especially in someone like Officer Anderson, filled her with a quiet pride. You've done the hard work, she said gently. It's not about one moment. It's about how you keep showing up, how you keep choosing to do the right thing, even when it's hard. Officer Anderson nodded, his gaze thoughtful. I understand that now. I still have a lot to learn, but I'm committed to being better. Elizabeth smiled. That's all anyone can ask for. We're all a work in progress. As they stood there, talking, Elizabeth felt a sense of fulfillment. She had helped start something bigger than just her or Officer Anderson. It was the beginning of a community coming together, of people learning to see each other for who they really were, not for their stereotypes or biases. It was about understanding, respect, and empathy. And that, she knew, was the most important thing of all. As the conversation continued, Elizabeth could see the subtle but powerful transformation in Officer Anderson. He had learned, but more importantly, he was teaching others what he had learned. And in doing so, he was helping build a future where people were not judged by the color of their skin, the job they had, or the mistakes they had made. He was helping create a future where people were judged by the content of their character. And for Elizabeth, that was more than enough. The sun was setting now, casting a golden light over the street. The neighborhood, once divided, was now unified by the shared values of respect and understanding. And as Elizabeth looked around, she knew that the small acts of kindness, the quiet moments of change, were the things that would make the world a better place. It was the kind of change that didn't require applause or recognition. It was the kind that came from the heart. And in that moment, Elizabeth felt a deep sense of peace, knowing that she had been a part of something beautiful, something lasting. Months had passed since that turning point, and the changes in the neighborhood were becoming more and more evident. Elizabeth continued her daily routine, but there was a subtle shift in how she viewed the world. The connection she felt with the people around her had deepened, and the atmosphere of the community was undeniably different. There was a quiet strength in the way people now engage with each other, a sense of shared responsibility that had not been there before. She had never been one to seek recognition for her role in the transformation, but she could feel the difference in the way people spoke to each other, the way they supported one another. It wasn't just the youth, the ones Officer Anderson had worked so hard to connect with. It was everyone. As she sat on her porch one morning, enjoying the warmth of the sun and the sounds of the neighborhood, Elizabeth reflected on how far they had all come. The day was peaceful, with children running and laughing, and neighbors chatting on their way to work. It felt like home, like a place where people cared about each other. It wasn't perfect, no community ever was, but it was real, and that was enough. Officer Anderson, too, had found his place. She often saw him walking through the streets, not with the stern posture of someone enforcing the law, but with the relaxed demeanor of someone who had found a purpose beyond his uniform. He had become a mentor, a guide, not just for the young people, but for anyone who needed help, anyone who was struggling. He wasn't just teaching them lessons in respect and understanding. He was showing them that it was okay to ask for help, that it was okay to be vulnerable and honest. That was the real power, Elizabeth thought. It wasn't the badge, the uniform, or the authority. It was the ability to listen, to empathize, and to offer support when it was needed the most. One afternoon, Elizabeth was walking through the park when she noticed Officer Anderson sitting on a bench, talking to a group of teenagers. It wasn't the usual group, the ones who had once been hard to reach. These kids were different, more reserved, unsure of what to make of the officer's presence. She watched as Officer Anderson spoke to them gently, offering advice and encouragement, but not in a way that felt forced. There was no authority in his tone, There was only understanding. As she walked closer, he saw her and smiled. "Good afternoon, Elizabeth," he greeted her, his voice warm. "I was just telling these kids about how important it is to learn from each other, to ask questions, and to never stop growing." Elizabeth smiled back, taking a seat beside him. She had seen the impact he had on the community, on the young people, but she had never witnessed him so fully in his element. "I'm glad to see you here," she said. "It's been a long road, but it's clear that you've found your way." Officer Anderson nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I've been learning a lot, more than I ever expected." He glanced over at the teenagers, who were now listening intently to him. "It's not just about being the authority. It's about being a part of the community. And it's about teaching others to be kind, to listen, to respect one another." Elizabeth felt a sense of pride well up inside her. It wasn't just the work Officer Anderson had done with the youth. It was the way he had come to understand that the most important thing in life was how you treated others. The respect, the kindness, it was the foundation of everything. "You've made a real difference," Elizabeth said softly. "And so have they." She motioned to the teenagers, who were now engaging with the officer, asking questions, and laughing. Officer Anderson followed her gaze and smiled. "It's not just me," he said. "It's all of us. It's about building something together, brick by brick." As they sat in silence, watching the group, Elizabeth realized how much had changed. The once cold, distant feeling she had once had about her community was gone, replaced by a sense of belonging and connection. The people in this neighborhood weren't just neighbors anymore. They were friends, they were family. It was a community that had learned to support each other, to show up for each other, and to grow together. And it was because of small moments like these, small acts of kindness and understanding, that the neighborhood had transformed. Elizabeth knew there was still work to be done. There were always challenges to face, obstacles to overcome. But as she sat beside Officer Anderson, watching the teenagers laugh and engage with each other, she felt a quiet sense of hope for the future. It wasn't just a hope for change. It was a hope for something even more powerful. It was the hope that, through understanding and respect, the world could become a better place for everyone. She looked over at Officer Anderson, who was now talking to one of the teenagers with a gentle smile on his face. He had come so far, and she had seen the change in him. It wasn't just the community that had transformed, it was him too. And that, she thought, was the most important change of all. It was the change that would last, that would ripple out into the world, and inspire others to do the same. That, in the end, was the real power of kindness and understanding.